which we won't be covering today. Today is just introduction to React and React hooks. Okay, I think we're gonna get started in just a minute or two. Yeah, in case some other people trickle in. But I think I can start with sharing my screen just to make sure that everyone can see it and it's good there. Okay. Okay, can someone confirm in the chat that you can see my screen? Cool. React is confusing. Hopefully after today, it won't be as confusing. Thanks, Queenie. I'm excited too. This is so cool, responding to the chat. I feel like I'm like live streaming or something. That's true. And also, hi to everyone that's watching on YouTube. Thanks for joining as well. Yeah, so it's also available. All of the Gear Up workshops are also available on YouTube to the public, so anyone can join. Because Hopin is restricted just to hackers. Yeah, thanks for the link there. Okay, so I think I'm going to get started. Thanks, Mo. Also excited. Okay, yeah, we're going to get started now. So I guess to start, thank you everyone for joining today's session. I'm so glad to have everyone here. I'm really excited for this and to share, a little bit about React. So today will be an introduction, a beginner/intermediate introduction to React plus what React hooks are. And hopefully by the end of today, we will build your first React app if you haven't already done so. All right. Okay, so before we jump into it, a little bit about myself. So hi, I'm Leslie. I'm currently a third-year student studying systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo. I guess outside of work and school and stuff, I like to paint and also collect plants. So feel free to ask me questions about those things as well. But just quickly, before I talk more about myself, I wanted to mention that I have 3 great workshop helpers today. You can see them. They're also part of the presentation, but we have Ekaspreet, Anshul, and Aman, and they will be the ones that will be responding to most of your comments in the chat. So yeah, they'll be helping out and also sending any useful links throughout the workshop. Okay, and before we jump into the actual workshop, I wanted to talk about just kind of my background and why I decided to do this workshop today. So as I mentioned, I'm in the co-op program at the University of Waterloo. So I'm super lucky to have already done 5 internships throughout my undergrad and 3 specifically in front end. And those front end internships have been at places like Microsoft, a startup in Norway, and most recently at Shopify. But before all of my front-end internships, I used to be a back-end developer, actually. And my transition to a back-end developer was really natural for me, just coming from high school, taking computer science courses, and also more courses in university. And I think it's natural for a lot of people, just if you learn something like Python or Java as your first language. And then also, before, when I was a back-end developer, I was honestly super scared of front-end. I had no idea what it was. I had no idea how to work with it. And I also had some pretty silly misconceptions about what front-end meant and what it was. And I just wanted to share that, after almost 2 years of being a front-end developer, all my misconceptions were totally untrue. And I've really found a love for it. And I've also discovered that, front-end in general as a field and discipline is extremely human. So, not only at work do we work super closely with users and designers, we also, I also find that just like as humans, we're inspired and engaged by, our senses and being able to work with things that are tangible, and just it's super magical to build something out of nothing. yeah, so I just wanted to share that. And let's jump into it. And also here are some socials if you'd like to connect. I'm always happy to do so. Okay, cool. So this is kind of the structure of today. We're going to go over a quick introduction, cover, hopefully review, but the building blocks of a website, very similar to what was covered in the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript workshop yesterday. Afterwards, we're going to move on to what is React, and together we're going to build, or actually, sorry, you're going to watch me build the world's most basic React app, just a one-page app, and this part will be more conceptual and theory-based. And then the part where the live coding happens will be in Create React App. We're going to learn about pretty much the easiest way to get started with React and the best way for a hackathon, especially. And then at the beginning of this section, we'll also take a quick break. And then finally, we're going to cover React hooks, and we're going to talk about what they are and why they're so special. All right. So what you're going to need for this workshop. So this information should all be in the hack pack and syllabus, which I think is linked below. But if not, the links are all here. So first of all, you're going to need an ID for today. So ID, or an integrated development environment, is just, you know, a fancy way of saying like a text editor with some other tools. Today I'll be using VS Code, which is what I prefer and what I recommend. And here's the download link. But if you're comfortable with something else, or you're more familiar with something else, you can go ahead and use that. Secondly, you're going to need Node installed on your machine. Here's the website to download it if you don't have it downloaded already. Hopefully you do. And then also, if you're using a Mac and you have Homebrew, you can install it with this command super easily. And then lastly, it'll be really helpful to have the linked resources open or easily accessible throughout the workshop. So the hack pack and syllabus, and then also the GitHub repository. So here's the link, and I think my workshop helpers will be sending the link to the chat as well. But I can quickly walk through this. So if you open up the link, you should see this page. And essentially what I've done is I've broken down the workshop in just 3 sections, similar to what we saw in the agenda. So there will be basic React, create React app, and then lastly, React hooks. So as I mentioned earlier, the basic React will just be me coding. There's no need to follow along for this section because it's mostly theoretical. And then the part where you all can join in will be create React app and React hooks. And I've broken it down with commits. So basically, if you open up each of these links in a new tab, you'll see the state of the code at exactly that stage. And then you can do that for any of these sections. Cool. All right, so I guess let's jump into it. Okay, so starting with what makes a website. Okay, so I made this illustration inspired by one I saw online, but the main components of a website are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML is the structure of your website. It's the sections your website has, what types of sections they are, and then also what order they're in. Next, we have CSS, or cascading style sheets. This determines the style of a website. So it's what enables our websites to not look like trash, and what allows us to make them unique and add elements of design. Lastly, we have JavaScript, which is the interactivity. It's what lets us make our websites more complex and also allows the user to interact with them through things like forms or buttons or the keyboard. A cool fact about JavaScript is that it doesn't have anything to do with Java. It was actually named JavaScript to ride on the popularity of Java at that time, which I thought was pretty cool when I learned that. All right. Okay, next. So that was just a quick review, but next we're going to jump in. What is React? Okay, what is React? So taken straight from the React docs, React is an open source front-end JavaScript library for building user interfaces or UI components. Okay, so let's break this down. When it says open source, what it means is basically like the code is open and available on the internet for you to look through. And then library, if you haven't used a library or a framework before, no worries. It's just a fancy way of saying a structure that defines the way apps are written. And libraries and frameworks do this by setting a super clear set of rules about how data can flow through the app, and then also how the UI or the user interface will adapt as a result of that changing data. And then also a little bit more about React. I think it was released in 2013 and was created by Facebook and is also maintained by Facebook. All right, so now we know a little bit about what is React, why React, and why what makes it unique. So in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, React is unique because of these two main things. One being components, the second being the virtual DOM. Okay, so components, what are they? So components are, or allow us to break down complex user interfaces into modular parts or smaller sections. Components are unique because one, they're encapsulated, which is just a fancy way of saying each component worries about itself. Each component worries about its own data and its own state. And secondly, and most importantly, components are reusable. And what this means is you can define a component one time and then use it as many times as you'd like. One analogy I really love is the rubber stamp analogy. So similar to a component where you define it once, you can buy a rubber stamp just one time, but you can use that stamp like as many times as you'd like. All right, and next, the virtual DOM. So there's a library called React DOM, which creates a virtual representation of the real DOM. And what the real DOM is if you go to any website, and here we have GitHub, if you right click inspect, and then see all of the HTML elements here, this is what composes the DOM. It's basically the structure of what our website is. But the reason why React has a virtual DOM is because it's really expensive and really slow to manipulate or to change the real DOM. So React has this virtual DOM, which lets React know exactly when it needs to re-render, exactly when it needs to change. So basically, React only re-renders the parts of the page that need to change instead of reloading the entire page, which would be super slow. And the fact that React has a virtual DOM is what makes it fast. Okay, cool. All right, so for today's workshop, we're going to be creating a restaurant app together. And as an example here, I have a screenshot of the Uber Eats website. And anytime you start a new React project or a front-end project, what you usually want to do is start with an idea and ideally a design, kind of like we have here. And then you want to break that design down into its foundational components. So what I've done is exactly that. We have the title component up here. We have this navigation bar, and then we have all of these dish cards. And you can see with these dish cards that they're pretty much the same, but they only differ with these small things, the title is different, for example, the name of the dish, and the price is different. So let's keep that in mind. All right, so after we've done that, this is kind of what we'll be building today. So we don't have time to build an entire Uber Eats app, but we'll be building, again, as I said, a super simple version of it. And we'll just be creating two components instead of all the ones from before. So the two components will be the app, which is the kind of the body of the component. It's the base, and then, the body of the app. And then after, we'll be creating the dish components. And it'll have the data name. So just, the name of the dish, whatever the dish is, and then the count. And what I mean by count is if this is, for example, a ordering app like Uber Eats, you want to know how many of each dish you'd like to order. So this is kind of what we're going to aim to recreate today. And then once you've gotten this down, the next step in building your app is you want to take these components and build a component tree. And this is just a representation of how the components are linked together. So the other cool thing with React components is that not only are they reusable, they also, you can nest components underneath each other. So this app component, which is called a parent component, has these children components, which are the dishes. All right, so as we just talked about, each component needs data. So in the dish component, you can see we have name and count. And although they are both relevant to dish, we get them in different ways. So let's first talk about the name, the name data. All right, you can see here that I have props and then name. So props is short form for properties or React properties. And this is super simple to super similar to HTML properties, if you're familiar with that. So for example, in HTML, if you have a div and then you have the ID property and you pass in some value, basically that's how you pass in data to the HTML tag. In the same way, when we have a property in React, like a name property, for example, that's how we pass data to another React component, the child of the component that we're in. So if we're an app and we have the data name, we use props, the concept of React props, to pass the name to the dish. All right, now let's move on to the second piece of data. So now we know how name works. Let's talk about count. So count is different than name, or different than props, because each component worries about its own count. So even though in each component there's the same variable, it's like all name count, each of these variables have a unique value. So for example, this dish component can have a count of 0, and then the second dish component can have a count of 2. And we managed these variables with something called React state. So state is a way for us to keep track of these kind of unique variables that change value over the lifetime of a component, a specific instance of a component, as opposed to props, which we get once from the parent and do not change over the lifetime of the component. Okay, cool. So now that we know a little bit about the foundations of React, I'm going to jump into the first live coding session. So again, this part, like, you can just watch. It's more conceptual. It's going to be about theory. And this is something that I decided to include today because I wish someone walked through this with me when I started learning React. You know, I jumped straight into like create React app, which was a lot more complicated. And I just wish someone walked me through the basics. So that's what we're going to do today. All right, so I'm going to start with going to my desktop and creating a new folder. And I'm going to call this simple restaurant app. Oh my gosh, it's already taken. Okay, I'm going to call this simple app. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to open up that folder using my IDE. And again, I'm using VS Code today. And just let me know in the chat if you can see this. Okay, cool. I'm going to open up the folder in my IDE. It's on my desktop. It's called Simple App. All right, and once it's opened, I'm going to create a new file in here. Just one file, and I'm going to call it index.html. This is very similar to if you were just creating like a static website, you'd kind of do the same thing. And then to get started, I'm going to start with putting in a basic HTML scaffold. And what a scaffold is just like the structure of a basic HTML page. And I'm going to do this with a really handy extension that VS Code has that helps with abbreviation. So if I type in HTML:5, you'll see here it says Emmet Abbreviation. And Emmet is a tool that basically auto-completes a bunch of like scaffolding things. So you'll see, like, if I click enter, it'll set up a basic HTML file for me, which is really convenient. All right, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the body, make a new div. We're going to write hello world, something super simple. And then I'm going to pass in a property, HTML property, ID, and then we're going to call that root. We hit save and then move over to our browser. I'm going to open up the file in my browser. And we should see hello world. Perfect. Okay, so this is, the most simple HTML kind of page. All right, so now we're going to transform it into a React app. So we have to do that first by importing React. I'm going to do that by adding in a script tag. And I'm going to add in the source for this. And I'm going to copy and paste in this link that I have here. And this link is to something called a CDN. And what a CDN is it stands for a content delivery network, but it's just a fancy way of saying it's this bucket, basically this place that hosts a bunch of NPM packages, basically a bunch of libraries and data that we can grab. So that's how we're going to access React. And then I'm going to let me close this so it's a little larger. Okay, and then we're going to add in another script tag. And here we're going to import in, same as the one before, except the only difference is instead of React, this one is going to be importing React DOM. As you can see here, it's React-DOM instead of React. And then we're going to click Save. So you might be wondering, like, why do we have to import two packages? Why can't it just be all wrapped up in one? And that's because with the kind of the questions that were asked before about React Native, the React package is shared between React and React Native. And then the DOM is specifically for rendering things to the browser. So that's why we need those two.
Hey, Leslie, sorry, just to jump in. Could you just zoom in on VS Code? So
oh, yeah, sorry. Sorry about that. Is that better? Let me know in the chat if that's better, or should I make it even larger?
I think even larger. Yeah, that might be good.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. Okay, it seems like that's better. All right, yeah, thanks for letting me know. Okay, so now that we've clicked Save, we go into our browser. Nothing's changed because we haven't rendered anything new, but if we click Inspect and go to our console and we type in React. Oh, no, did I not save this? All right, yeah. Okay, if we type in React, we should see that it's now defined. It's not undefined anymore, which means we have access to it. And same with React DOM. Should be defined unless I have a typo here.
I'm missing an R in the script tag.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So if I type in React DOM, okay, cool. Now it's defined. All right. So now we have React, imported. Let's write our first React component. So we're going to open up the script. And again, I'm going to move this kind of quickly, so there's no need to follow along here. But I'm going to start with making the app component, as you see here, the base of our app. I'm going to define a functional component, which basically means it's a normal JavaScript function, but it returns some markup. All right, so we're going to call it app. I'm writing a arrow function here, and then we're going to return so as I mentioned, what makes a React component a component is that it returns some markup. So we do that by returning, we're going to call React, and then call this function create element. And the function create element takes in 3 parameters. The first one is either an HTML tag or a custom React component. But to start, we're just going to do a simple HTML tag, so an H1. The second parameter is the data that you want to pass down to the children, so the props. But because we're just going to build something super simple, we're not going to have props yet. And then the third parameter is it's either a string, so if you're rendering a HTML tag, it's the string that you want to render to the page, so the text, or if you're rendering a custom component, this is where you would put the children, so whatever components you want to render underneath it. But in this case, I'm just going to write the title. So it's going to be Hack the North Restaurant, and then we're just going to end it off with a semicolon, and we're going to click Save. And if we go here and refresh, nothing's going to happen because, again, with components, you define them first, but they don't actually work until you've used them. And we're going to use them by rendering it, and we're going to do that this way. So we're going to call React. We're going to use React DOM, call the render function. And then the render function takes in 2 parameters. So the first one being the component that you want to render, and then the second parameter being where you want to render it on the page. So to be able to render the component, we want to call React again, create element, and then we're going to pass in the app component. So again, as I was saying before, we define app, but we haven't created an instance of it yet. We haven't stamped it. And what React.createElement does is it creates an instance of either an HTML tag or a React component. And then for the second half of it, all we want to do is we want to do document dot get element by ID, which is basically injecting it into the root here. We'll just specify root. All right, and if we save this and refresh over here, now we see Hack the North restaurant. Super cool. So we created our first React component, or you've watched me create the first React component, and this is essentially like React super bare bones. This is like what React is at its core. And then I'm just going to really quickly show you how we can create children just by recreating the app. So the same syntax as before, const, we're going to call it dish this time. Again, I'm going to define an arrow function. And this time, instead of H1, we're going to turn in H2. Again, no data, no props yet, and I'm just going to render the text dish. All right, if we save this and refresh here, again, nothing's going to happen because we've defined our dish, but we haven't actually used it yet. And basically, we render dish to the page by specifying it as a child of app. Because here, when we render it, we'll render app, and subsequently, all of its children will render as well. Okay, so we specified that dish is a child of app by doing this. So we're going to change this h1 to a div, which is kind of like a HTML wrapper tag. And here, instead of the string, we are going to render a list. So we're going to put in, the title again, or just write it out. We're going to put in the title that we had before. So it's an H1 and Hack the North restaurant. And underneath it now, we're going to render the instances of dish. So we're going to do that very similarly to the way we render the H1. So react.create element, and I'm going to pass in the dish object. And I'm not the other parameters are optional. So I'm just going to choose not to pass in anything right now. So if I save this and refresh over here, now we should see dish rendered to the page, which is super cool. But we haven't even leveraged the power of React yet. So the power of React components is that you can define it once and use it as many times as you'd like. And how we do that is just specifying that, app has more children. So just copy and paste, add more of the dish instances to the list here. And if we save it and refresh over here, you'll see we have multiple dishes, which I think is pretty cool. All right. Cool. Now together we've built, the world's simplest React app, but let's talk about realistically how you'd start a React project, because no one actually codes React like this. This is just an example of what React is at its core. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. Cool. All right, so we're going to move on to create React app. Actually, let me just take a look at the chat to see if there's anything glaring. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks, Phoebe, about the slide deck. Okay, cool. So next, we're going to move on to create React app, and we're gonna take a break really soon. So again, taken straight from the React docs, create React app is a comfortable environment for learning React, and is the best way to start building a new single-page application in React. So again, let's break this down a little bit. So if you're not familiar with what a single-page application is, it's basically an app that works inside your browser and doesn't require an entire page reload when using it. So most of the apps that you use or the websites you go to are probably single-page applications. So that's basically what it means. And what is Create React App? Essentially, Create React App is React's most popular tool chain. And what a tool chain is, it's just a fancy way of saying a bunch of React tools put together in a way that makes developers' lives easier. And also, the React tool chains like Create React App, for example, come with other helpful things as well, like testing or analytics for your website. Okay, all right. So now that we have kind of an idea of what Create React App is, we can start building our first React app. So this is where we can build it together and everyone can follow along. All right, so I'm gonna go and open up my terminal. So everyone can do that. Cool. And in my terminal, I'm going to navigate to the location where I want to store this project. And to be able to see kind of where you are.
Can you zoom in a bit?
Sorry?
Can you zoom in your terminal?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you. Keep on reminding me if things are too small. Is that good?
Yeah, we will.
Okay, cool.
That's cool.
So, okay. All right, so in my terminal, I'm first going to type ls if I would just want to see the different, directories or folders I have here. I'm going to put it on my desktop because it's easily accessible. So to be able to enter that folder, I'm going to type cd and then the name of it. So desktop. Or yeah, thank you for the Windows command. All right, and then I'm going to click enter, and then I've entered my desktop. Okay, and in here, we're going to type in this command. We're going to type in npx create -react -app. And I have 2 E's. All right, so we're going to type in npx create react app, and then afterwards, you're going to type in the name of your React app, so whatever you'd like to call it. I'm going to call it Hack the North Workshop Restaurant app. Okay, and you're going to click enter. And then after a few seconds, you should see it's busy doing its work. So it says creating a new React app in whatever directory that you chose. I'm just going to come back to the chat to make sure everyone is okay. So Stephen, am I supposed to download the Create React App package? So all you should need is Node, which is where like the npx command is from. So npx is just an extension to npm, and npm stands for Node Package Manager, which is, as its name described, just like a tool for helping you manage your dependencies and your packages. Okay, and this will take a couple minutes. So this is where I was thinking we could take a break. So you can go, I don't know, grab some water or something. And also shout out to the workshop helpers. You're doing a great job answering all these questions.
Probably Leslie, you can answer one question while their packages are getting downloaded. So a wonderful question from Ava. I'm not sure. So it's mentioned are props like keys and states like values referencing Python dictionaries?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sorry. So the question is, are props like keys and states like values referencing Python dictionaries?
Oh, okay. Let me know if I understood your question. So are you asking like, are Python dictionaries kind of like JavaScript objects, and are props and state objects where
Exactly.
you have like keys?
This is the question, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it is very similar. So in a Python dictionary, you have your keys, which let you access, certain values in your Python dictionary. In the same way, you have JavaScript objects, which also have like keys. So props, for example, like if you come here, props is an object and the key will be a name. In the same way, like state is an object and the key will be count. And you can have multiple props, like multiple props variables and multiple state variables in this props and state objects.
Yeah, there's another question related to it probably. Are React elements like Java classes where you use the template of objects?
Yeah, they're very similar. And I think it'll make more sense when we move into the Create React app part, because we'll be creating a class component, which is basically a JavaScript class, very similar like Java classes where they have like a constructor and functions and etc. And the way that we have multiple components or multiple instances of a component is very, very similar to like object-oriented programming. For Stephen, you're asking how to get on your desktop. So basically, wherever you ran the command, the npx create React app, it'll be created in that directory. So to be able to get on your desktop, you would just like navigate to whatever directory you want. But if you've already created it, you can just simply like copy it over to wherever you want or drag it over. I downloaded Node, but I'm having an error when I type in npx. Could you type in just Node into your terminal and see what it returns?
Yeah, Leslie, could you just remind everyone of the command that you entered to create React app?
Yeah, let me type it to the chat, actually, that would be easier. So you want to type in npx create -react. Okay, I just sent it to the chat. So it's npx create -react -app, and then whatever you want to name your app. Okay. Has it finished downloading for anyone? Like, does anyone else see this page? Or like these, like yarn start, yarn build, happy hacking? Okay, perfect. Nice, okay. Okay, let's just give it another 30 seconds or so. We have to download every time we create a new app. Yeah, so if you're using Create React App, you're gonna have to download this every time because it's creating basically all the files you need for a new singular React project. Okay, cool. All right, so okay, I'm gonna open up the directory in my IDE now. So if I make a new window, open, and then again, as I mentioned, it's on my desktop, and I called it Hack the North Workshop Restaurant app. We're gonna open it up. And then once you open it up, hopefully you can see something like this. You should see the name of the project at the top in the root folder, and then you should see a bunch of different files and a bunch of folders underneath. Okay, and once everyone has it open, we're going to go back to our terminal, and exactly where it said happy hacking, we're going to type in npm start and then click enter. Oh, sorry. First, we want to navigate to our project. So first we want to enter, so cd, what did I call it again? Hack the North Workshop, I think restaurant app. So first you want to enter it to make sure that it says it here, that you're inside that folder. And then you want to type in npm start. And then it should, you should see some message that says React script start. Yeah, Phoebe, you can also use it. You can also use the VS Code terminal. So in VS Code, you can click here at the top, you should see terminal, new terminal, and then a terminal will open up down here. All right, and then after a while, it will say starting the development server, and it should automatically open up basically a new page in whatever browser you have open. If not, you can just go to your browser, make a new tab, and copy and paste. After this finishes, it'll give us the URL that we can access it at. Okay, that took a long time. But after it's done, it'll say compiled successfully, and then it'll say local, which is basically where you can run the website locally or the app locally. And you can, if it didn't open up automatically like it did here for me, you can just go into your new tab and copy and paste this URL, and then it should get you to the same place. All right, and as we see here, everyone should see a spinning React logo. Could you message the chat if everyone, or if you see that? And then also just some text. This is just the basic kind of React default app. Cool, nice. Okay, so now that we have this open, let's quickly walk through kind of the parts of Create React App. So let's go to the base of our app. So all of the code that we'll be worrying about is in source, this folder. So we want to open it up.
Leslie, sorry, can you zoom in folders so that they're more visible?
Yeah, sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay, cool. When I start the coding, I may need to zoom out just a little bit just to be able to fit all the code on the screen. But for now, okay, I'm glad that everyone can see it now. Okay, so if we open up the source folder, let's first go to the index.js file. What we're going to see in here is, I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller so we can see. What we're going to see in here is hopefully something that's recognizable to what we were doing before. So in kind of the world's most basic React app, we also had React DOM.render. And this is basically just injecting React into our browser. And similarly, it's rendering app, it's injecting app, and then this is where it's injecting it, the root, which is exactly the same as we had before. You can kind of ignore the strict mode. That's just some extra tool that React has for highlighting potential vulnerabilities in your application. But outside of the strict mode, it's pretty much the same as what we had before, which is pretty neat. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to click on index.css. And this is basically the CSS for the entire application. So this isn't a CSS workshop, but what I did do was I wrote some basic CSS just to make it a little bit nicer and a little bit more fun. The app that we're going to build. So if everyone could navigate to the GitHub repository. I can send this link again in the chat. If everyone can navigate to that GitHub repository and then click source. And then inside source, go to the index.css file. Or let me just send a link to the CSS file directly. All right, you should, thanks. Yeah, you should land on this page, and then what I want you to do is just copy all of the CSS. So you're gonna copy all of that, bring it over, and we're gonna erase everything that's in our CSS file in our project. And you're going to paste in what we copied in from GitHub, and then you're going to click Save or Command S or Control S. And then you should see React has this thing called hot reloading, which basically means you don't need to refresh the page. It refreshes automatically. But you should see that the page now has a different color background. All right, cool. Let me know if everyone has that, can see the pink in the back. Nice. Cool. Okay. All right, next. So if we go back to the index.js file, as we can see, it's the base, like the parent of this entire application is the app. So let's go and check out what's happening there. If we go to the app.js file, we'll see all of this code. And basically all of this is rendering, the spinning logo and all of this text, but we're not going to need that, right? So let's just get rid of it all. So basically all of this HTML code, let's delete it. Okay, and in here instead, let's just render, much like we did before, a basic div, and we're going to write hello world. Just something simple for now. And then we can also get rid of all of these imports because we don't need the logo and we're also not using the app CSS file. And then you can just give that a save. Cool. So basically we've just gotten rid of everything in the React app and starting from scratch. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to create our dish component. So what we're going to do is it's convention to put a new component in a new file. So we're going to click on the source folder and then make a new file in the source folder. So click new file. And we're going to call this new file dish.js. And we want to call the file the same name as the component. And then click enter. All right, so now we have a new, hopefully, everyone has a new file. And in here, if we go back to app, this is what's called a functional component. So very similar to what we did in the first section. It's basically a normal JavaScript function that returns some markup. But for dish, instead, because as we reviewed earlier, we want our dish to have state. Before React hooks were introduced, you could only have state in something called a class component. So we're going to do that first. We're going to build, a React project how you would before hooks were introduced, and then afterwards we're going to add in hooks and kind of see why they're so useful. Okay, so this is how we define a class component. We're going to start with importing React from React. And then we're going to type export, and this just makes, export just means making this component accessible outside of this file. Export class dish, so like any other JavaScript class, extends React component, and then finish it off with curly braces. All right, so now we have a basic JavaScript class, and we need to add in, two things to finish making it a class component. The first thing we want to do is we want to add in the constructor. So this is just like, typical for any class. We want to have a constructor. And we just do that by typing constructor. And then the one difference for kind of like React constructors is we want to call this function super. And essentially what super does is it's calling the constructor of the parent class. So because this is dish, it's calling the constructor of app, I guess if it was a class component. But basically what it does is it makes the data coming from the app accessible to us in dish. So if we want access to props, we need to call super. All right, and then the other thing we want to do to make this a React component is, remember we were saying before, like what makes a React component a component is that it returns some markup. So what we want to do is we want to make a new function and call it render. And this is one of the differences between class components and functional components. Before, you could just, return in the function because, functions return things. But in the class, we need to return the markup from a specific function. And React knows that it's always called render. So within this render function, we want to return. Again, we're just going to start off with a div, just super simple. And we're going to call it, just put dish, just some text in there for now. Okay, cool. So this is, the very basic skeleton of a React component. Now let's add in, the two pieces of the two ways of accessing data. So the one being first one being prop, second one being state. So first for props, because we're getting it from our parent, it's being passed into this component. We get it like the same way you would pass any data to a constructor or any JavaScript function, and that's through its parameters. So we want to add a parameter here, props. And then what we also want to do is we want to pass it to super. And what this means is when we pass props to super, it makes this keyword accessible in the constructor. Okay, and what this keyword is basically it references the object or the component in which it was called. So basically, every time I type in this, I'm just referencing this component, everything inside here. And the reason why we need to reference this in the constructor is because this is how we initialize our state. So now we have props, we have access to this variable inside the component. We want to create our state because state is unique and is contained within this component. And we initialize it by doing this. We type this dot state equals, and then the initial state object. This is what I was kind of talking about before, where a JavaScript object, it's like similar to a Python dictionary, but the type is an object for the state and props. And then we want to populate the object with whatever state variables we want. So we want to start with count. And then we also have to give it a value, which will be its initial value. So when its component is rendered for the very first time, this is what the value of count is. And it's going to be 0 because all dishes start at 0, I guess. Okay, cool. And I'm going to give this a save. All right, so now we've built up, our basic component, but we want to access this data and we want to present it to the screen. And we do this like this. All right, so the first thing is we're going to add another class to this div, and this is just like applying the CSS from before that we copied in. So we're just going to type in class name, and it's going to be dish. In normal HTML, it would just be class, but in React, it's class name. Class is lowercase and name is uppercase, or like the N is uppercase. And then within here, we want to render the two things, one being the name of the dish and the other one being how many of the dish we want to order. So in an H2, we're going to use curly braces. And basically, when we're writing our HTML or our markup, we use curly braces to tell kind of React that we're going to inject JavaScript into here. Because this is where we want to access props to grab the name of our dish. So how we access props is we have to use this keyword, which is just referencing, this component, dot props, which is the variable that's coming into the component, and then the name of the specific value we want from props, which will be called name. We want to give that a save. Okay. So after we've displayed name, and again, nothing is rendering to the screen because we're defining the dish component, but we haven't actually used it yet. We haven't defined it as a child of app, which is why it's not showing up. All right, and underneath it, I'm just going to use a normal, paragraph tag and put in write count. And then again, use the curly braces and access the state. So again, typing in this. And instead of props this time, I'm going to type in state. And then again, the variable, which is count. Cool. And we're going to save that. Okay, cool. So now that we have our component defined, what we want to do is we want to go back to app and actually render it as a child of app. And first, to be able to access it at all, and the reason why we exported it is because we need to import it. So we import it like this, import with curly braces, dish from ./dish. And that's just the name of the file that it's in. So it's importing this dish component from the dish file. And then inside the app, we're going to get rid of the hello world. And we're going to, well, let's first render, the title of our restaurant. So I'm going to use an H1. And we're going to call it Hack the North Restaurant again, or whatever you'd like to call your restaurant. And then underneath, just like we did in the super basic React app, we're going to render the dish component. Just the same way as you would like a HTML tag. Cool. And then the last thing we need to do is the dish component is expecting data from us, from the app component. It's expecting us to pass in name as props. So we do that by, just like you would an HTML prop, we just put the name of the variable here and then give a value to it. So does anyone have a favorite food that they like that they want me to put? Pizza, okay, cool. Pizza. Also, a cool tip is that you can now code with emojis. So let me see if I can demonstrate that. like you can add emojis to your code and use them as variable names, which I think is really funny. But okay, let's copy this dish multiple times because again, we're leveraging the reusability of components. And let's see if there's more. Let's see, sushi. What was the next one? Dim sum. Yum. I'm getting hungry now. Let's change these emojis. So let's see if we have a sushi emoji. Right. Cool. And dim sum. I don't know if there'll be a dim sum emoji. Okay. It's gonna be taco. I'm sorry. Then we're gonna save. And then this should render on its own. You can see here that it's compiling, which means it knows something has changed. And very cool. Now we have our restaurant. And as you can see, it has the title, it has all of our components, the names of them, and count equals 0. Cool. Nice. Okay. So now, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to React hooks, and then we're going to add in some other cool things to our app after we do hooks. Okay, so quickly to go back to our slides, React hooks. Okay, so again, taken straight from the docs, React hooks enable us to use state inside functional components and simplify code to make it easier to read. Okay, so the one main thing here that I want to share today is that you can use state inside functional components. That is pretty mind-blowing because before, if we go back to our code, our dish component, we had to make it a class. We had to add all these fancy things like add a constructor, call this weird super function, use this keyword, this.state. It's kind of confusing. And a lot of code that's kind of hard to understand. Hooks are kind of revolutionary because they enable us to use state super easily, but with a functional component, something as easy and simple as this. So let's give that a try. Let's refactor our code, which means to kind of change our code to use hooks instead. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to change the definition. So instead of class, we're going to export const, and we're going to define it the same way we did before, like an arrow function. Like that, and then we're going to get rid of the entire constructor, and we're going to get rid of this in the h2 and just leave the curly braces because we're still going to be writing some JavaScript in there. Okay, and then we're also going to get rid of the render because again, a function can just straight up return something. Okay. Now that we've gutted our dish component, let's add in the things that we took out. So the first thing we want to add in is state. And we do that by using a React hook called useState. So we import it like this from React. And all hooks they're just functions. So this useState is a function that we're going to use. And the way we're going to use it is we're going to come here and we're going to type const square brackets, and then the name of the state variable we had before, so count. Then we're going to type a comma, and then we're going to define a function that we can use to kind of change the value of count. And by convention, it's called set count. And then equal sign, and then we're going to call the useState function. And then what we pass in is the default value. So before it was 0. And that's it. That's like all you need to do to initialize state with hooks, which I think is super, super cool. All right, so now that we have the count, and how we use it is basically instead like here where we had this state.count before, which is kind of confusing. All we do is we just use the variable count. That's it. Oh no. Count. Like that. I know I accidentally imported this. But yeah, it's so much more simple. Okay, so now that we have countdown, let's add back in props. And how we do that is just how you would access, anything that was being passed into JavaScript function. So, but the parameters here, props, and then how we access the value of props is just props because it's an object, and then .name. And that's it. And if we click save and wait for this to recompile, cool. I guess nothing would have changed because it looks exactly the same, and that's what hooks are. It's like we can build the exact same things, just much easier. But now let's use the set count function. As you can see, there was a warning that says it's unused. Let's find a way to use it. And like the one thing we still haven't added is, even though the count is displayed as 0, there's no way for us to change it. There's nothing that I can interact with on the web page for me to be able to increase the value of count. So let's do that. So let's first add in a button. So an HTML button. The button, you can call it whatever you want, but I'm just going to call it add dish. And then as a property of the button, we're going to use the onClick property equals, and then these curly braces again. And basically what this is when the button is clicked, it's expecting a function here. It's going to trigger whatever function we pass into it. So let's write a quick function that gets triggered when we press this button. So the same way we defined this functional component, we're going to define another JavaScript function. So const, let's call the function add dish. And again, an arrow function. And in here, all we want to do is we want to increase the value of count by 1. And how we do that is by using the set count function. So all we do is we call set count, and then you pass in the new value of what you want count to be. And in our case, we want it to be the old value plus 1. And we do that just by getting the count variable and adding 1 to it. And then after we've defined this function, all we do is we the name of it here, pass it into onClick. So now every time we click this button, this function is going to be called, and the count will increase by 1. Okay, let's give that a save and wait for it to compile. All right, now on your screen, hopefully, let me know in the chat if you can see. Now on the screen, you should be able to see this new button. And if you click on it, the count will increase. And as you can see, this is a pretty good visualization of like the state in React, how if I click this add dish button, only the count for pizza will increase. And if I click add dish here, only the count for sushi will increase, and same with dim sum. So these variables, although they're all called count, they are independent of each other. Okay, very cool. I'm going to check the chat. Let me know if everyone can see that. Okay. No button appears for me. Did you, in the dish component, did you type in, like, add the button tag? Is set count a built-in method, or did you define it yourself? So basically what's happening here is technically we've defined it ourselves because you can name your state variables anything you want, but the return type of use state is a list. And basically it's a list, and the first element is the name of the state variable, and the second element, it's giving us a function to be able to change that state variable. And we are just basically setting names for those. And this syntax here is like JavaScript destructuring, so it's just a really easy way to access these variables directly. No button appears. The code is the same here in return. There's this button tag. It should, if you have, could you try maybe refreshing the page? Maybe something's off with the hot reloading. There's no white card look for my dish. So make sure that you have put the class name dish here in the div. Oh, nice. Okay, it works. Would it be better designed to have the name of the food in the state somehow instead of having different CSS for each food name? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by having different CSS for each food name. We don't. The CSS is basically targeting all of H2 tags. And technically, you can have the name inside the component, but like with React State, all of these components will be initialized with the same value. So if you want to have unique names, you're going to have to change it somehow through some user interaction. It's not too much sense to have the name there. Thanks for your comment, Kyle, about the brackets. Okay, because we're a little bit over time, I'm just going to go back and wrap up the presentation, but I will take more questions afterwards. All right, so very quickly here, I created kind of like an overall overview of our workshop. This is a really good thing to screenshot for the hackathon. It basically covers all of the important concepts that we went over today. So things like React's core features, the difference between class components and functional components, difference between state and props, and then the difference between having no hooks and having hooks. All right, and as the last slide, I just have some, final words I'd like to share. So thank you all for sticking with me and attending my workshop. I had a lot of fun, and I hope you did too. But I just wanted to mention that, there are all these, technical workshops, and especially if you're a beginner, it might be overwhelming, and it definitely was for me as a beginner. So I just wanted to, remind everyone to not take things too seriously, and it's just think about what we're doing right now. We are basically building a new application from scratch, from thin air, much like the applications that we use every single day, which I think is pretty cool. So yeah, just a reminder that, yeah, it's pretty magical what we're doing, and to not lose that.
Probably Leslie, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. So we're all going to stay on and answer some more questions. I like my workshop helpers will join the call if they would like to. And yeah, we can keep the conversation going here. If not, in a couple minutes, we'll move over to Discord as well in the front end channel. So you can find us there too. How do I type emojis into VS Code? So if you're on a Mac and you want to access emojis anywhere, you can just type or hit Control Command Spacebar, and it'll open up the emoji picker. Can you share slides, please? Yes, I will share the slides. I could do that right now, actually. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Any recommended VS Code plugins for React? So yeah, there are a lot of one of the reasons why VS Code is so great is because it has a lot of extensions that you can add. I recommend I pretty much just have the basic ones, like the basic linting ones I recommend. And also if you start a new, and Emmet, yeah, but Emmet should come with VS Code. But yeah, if you start basically typing in a new language, VS Code is smart enough to recognize that you're building a project with that, and it'll recommend some helpful extensions for you. Emmet was basically, if you remember to the very beginning when we were building the world's simplest React app, it was like the shortcut, the abbreviation, where I typed in HTML:5. Yeah, so Emmet is already built into VS Code, but if you're using another IDE, like, I don't know, Sublime or Atom or something, you can also just install it yourself.
Also, if people are using HTML and CSS, so they can use Live Server for running their applications.
Yeah, it's a really good note. In terms of styling, how would we apply different styles to the individual dish cards? Normally I would just give them IDs, but I'm not sure how to do that since they all direct. Yeah, so that's the thing with components. You essentially are styling, like the way you normally write like CSS for HTML tags, or write new CSS classes. Like if you define them for the component, they're going to apply to all the components. But the way you can kind of work around that is you can have like conditional CSS. So basically like different elements of the CSS change based on the data in your component. Have you worked with Next.js before? I actually haven't worked with it. I'm keen to do so. Next.js, if you're unaware, is another React tool chain. So like today we use Create React App, which is one. I think Next.js is better for server-side rendering. And I don't think it's as heavy as Create React App. Like it doesn't come with as many things
Yeah,
off the
that's
bat.
correct. It's SSR.
So CSS styling is automatically applied to components as long as we put the class names correct. We don't need to import the different CSS files. Yeah, so if you're like if your application grows bigger and more complex, you can have separate CSS files. So right now we just put everything in index.css for the sake of the workshop, but you can create new files like app.css or dish.css. And what you do is you just import it into like any of the components that you're using it in. And then again, just apply the class names. If anyone is interested in about like styling in general, like something that I prefer to use is something called styled components. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with them, but basically it's a way to let you write your CSS within your React file. I can type it to the chat if anyone would like to look it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the importing. There was one question earlier about whether the CSS file was imported. So if you look in the index.js file, it is imported there, like the index.css file. So that's how it works. So if, for example, if you wanted to make a dish.css file, you could import that in your dish component directly, and so on as you create more components.
Okay, I'm gonna quickly share the link to the slides, and then after I think we're gonna hop off and move on to Discord. Okay, I've just sent the link to the slides in the chat. I made my slides using Figma, so it's a Figma prototype. And actually there's a workshop on introduction to Figma happening, I think, during Gear Up, so that would be a really great one as well. Edward's question, how would you dynamically add or remove React components? Yeah, so are you asking like conditionally render things? Like based on some variable or some data, render different React components?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably, Edward, you can create another component and you can add a switch operator there, and every switch route will have a different JSX returning from there, and that JSX will actually be another component. So yeah, you can add and remove dynamically various React components. So switch operator is your answer actually.
Yeah, and one other thing, I guess, for your hackathon, one additional library is like React Router, which if you start Googling things, you'll probably come across, but it's basically the way to render, kind of like with the switch operator, render different components depending on the URL of the page. If you have like a home page and then like a restaurant page, for example. Yeah.
Any resources you would recommend for continuing to learn React? That's a really great question. I think the React docs are really good. Like they have really good introduction, like introductory articles. And the other resource I recommend is, it's in the syllabus. Let me see if I can pull it up right now. But there's a site called Frontend Masters, which basically hosts a bunch of front-end related tutorials and workshops and courses. But they have a complete introduction to React v6, I think. And yeah, their workshop is great. Or sorry, their course is really great. Let me see if I have the link on me. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the link was just set in the chat. Let me see. I think there's a specific GitHub repository. So I think Frontend Masters in general, you have to pay for to access the courses, but all of their course resources are free. Okay, cool. I just found it. So Kyle, I just sent the link to the chat. It's just a GitHub site, but it has like basically a bunch of sections, different concepts of React, and also links to the source code, I'm pretty sure, for the project that they build.
I've also shared two links. So one is Egget.io, is also very competitive and competitive in terms of Frontend Masters is concerned. And there's another link, Frontend Mentor. So you can look for various challenges over here and try to do it in React or any framework which you believe you want to learn.
Cool, and we have a few more questions here. Do you have any tips for integrating CSS libraries with React components? Yes, I recommend using this library called Styled Components, which does exactly that. It lets you write your CSS directly in your React file, which basically keeps everything contained and organized. Yeah, so I recommend styled-components. And then another question from Eric, just to clarify, if there is, what would be a better scenario to use a functional component over a class component? Yeah, that's a really great question. So before the introduction of hooks in late 2018 or beginning of 2019, you had to use class components if you wanted to have state in your applications, which was a lot of the time. So our React apps would basically be a lot of different class components, which, as we went over today, they're kind of clunky and their syntax isn't very intuitive. But now with the introduction of hooks, there's pretty much no reason to use class components anymore. You can accomplish everything you need to do with class components with hooks. There are literally no downsides to using hooks. Like the only con that I've ever seen is just like you have to use them in the correct way. You have to make sure you're following the rules of hooks, and you have to kind of familiarize yourself with a new concept. Other than that, there's really no downside.
Probably Eric can get this answer best if he can explore Babel and Webpack. So they are the two reasons why class components are much heavier as compared to functional hooks components. So yeah, Babel and Webpack would be a way around to explore.
And that's all included in like the Create React app, like skeleton. For example, like in the very first world's basic React app we made, like there was no Babel, no Webpack, just React at its core.
It's a complete boilerplate for anyone to start with.
If I wanted to integrate Bootstrap with my app, I actually haven't integrated Bootstrap with the React app, but I'm pretty sure it would be the same way you would like without React. I don't know if anyone can confirm that. Has anyone used Bootstrap with React?
Yeah, yeah. Boomla and many other frameworks are easily integratable.
Cool. Is there any scenario where you would use vanilla JS over React? Yeah, for sure. So if you have more of like a static site, so basically a site that's just presenting information, it's not too robust, I would say for something like a personal website, it's probably better to just use like your HTML, CSS, JavaScript. React is usually used for something that it's like more complex if you want to do things like integrate it with a backend. But if you have just like a non-interactive site that's not too heavy, I think maybe it's a little bit too much overhead to use React. Unless you'd like to learn it, then that's fine. Like my personal site is built with React, so I can't really say anything there. Okay, I think we're gonna hop off and head on to Discord now. But again, thank you everyone, especially for staying on for so long. And yeah, I had a really great time, and I hope you all learned something. Okay. Oh, thanks. And yeah, also thank you to the workshop helpers. Thank you so much for taking care of the questions in the chat.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah, happy to help, and we'll be available all weekend, I guess, on Discord if anyone needs help with React or any other front-end questions.
Yeah,
Happy to help.
absolutely. Okay, I think this is where we say bye. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy the rest of Hack the North.
Bye.